What if the place you run to for healing isn't a sanctuary, but a trap designed to consume your soul? In tonight's story, we follow Lucas Merrick, a broken man desperate to escape his past, who stumbles upon Morrow Creek Sanctuary, a secluded retreat that promises rebirth, but hides a horrifying collective consciousness. As he unravels the sanctuary's dark secrets, Lucas is forced to confront a chilling question. How much of yourself would you sacrifice to be free of pain? Stay with me, if you dare, and discover what happens when the line between salvation and surrender vanishes forever. They tell you rock bottom has a shape, that you'll know when you hit it because you'll feel the thud in your bones, a final, hollow echo that tells you there's no further down to go, but no one ever tells you how quiet it is when you get there. I was 29 when my life began to unravel faster than I could patch the seams. In Los Angeles, you're surrounded by the kind of people who mistake hustle for salvation. They drink overpriced matcha and fill their mornings with podcasts on manifesting abundance. You'd think that energy would be contagious, that if you breathed the same air, something would spark inside you. But for me, the air felt like it was siphoning away the last of my oxygen. I used to believe I was building something meaningful. I worked freelance design gigs, logos for health startups, websites for influencers, album covers for local bands no one will remember in 2 years. I told myself I was creating, but every day blurred into the next. The endless revisions, the passive-aggressive client emails, the self-help quotes taped to my cracked bathroom mirror. Then came her, Sophie. We met at a pop-up gallery in Silver Lake, a place that smelled like wet concrete and overpriced incense. She was a sculptor, the kind who saw shapes where I saw only empty space. For a while, it felt like she carried the light I couldn't find in myself, but lights like hers don't stay. They move on to brighter rooms, better muses. She left me on a Thursday morning as the city was still yawning itself awake. She left a note on the kitchen counter, 3 lines scrawled in her messy looping script. Lucas, I'm sorry, I need to grow, and I can't do it here, not with you. Please, don't look for me. I didn't look for her, not because I respected her wishes, but because I knew I wouldn't find her. After she left, something inside me went silent. The first few days I waited for the hurt to surface. I thought I'd rage or cry, smash the cheap dishes from Target, maybe spiral into some public meltdown. But instead I found myself sitting on the balcony at 3 a.m., staring at the orange haze of the city, listening to the faraway sirens. I realized that the city itself had become a giant lung, breathing in all my energy and exhaling emptiness. Sleep turned into a myth. Nights bled into days in a slow-motion nightmare. I tried to keep working. I told myself deadlines would anchor me, that if I just finished this logo, that website, that pitch deck, I might feel like a person again. But every time I sat at my laptop, the screen glared back at me like a witness to my failure. Then came the panic attacks. You know that moment when you're underwater and you realize you don't have enough air to make it back up? That was my mornings. Heart hammering, sweat soaking the sheets, fingers clawing at the mattress. And then there was the night everything shifted. It was one of those nights where the world felt like it was folding in on itself. My apartment, normally a cluttered mess of unfinished coffee mugs and dusty books, felt too small, too tight, like it might swallow me whole. I sat there in the dark, knees pulled to my chest, scrolling through Reddit, Craigslist, any rabbit hole that could numb me for a few minutes. That's when I saw it. An ad posted in a forgotten corner of an online job board. Caretaker needed. Live-in position, secluded property in Oregon forest. No experience necessary. Room, board, and monthly stipend provided. Must be open-minded. For those ready to start anew. The phrase "start anew" hit me like a bullet. I clicked through. The posting was almost poetic, peppered with cryptic phrases about deep purification and becoming part of something eternal. It sounded like a cult ad, but that night, the word cult didn't scare me. It felt like an invitation. I stared at the screen for an hour, then 2. Then the sun began clawing its way over the horizon, smearing the sky with a gray that looked more like ash than morning. I didn't think. I just started packing. A duffel bag with a few clothes, a sketchbook, a single framed photo of Sophie. I hesitated before tossing it into the bag, like it might bite me. I left my apartment key on the kitchen counter, next to a half-finished mug of stale coffee. The walls watched me leave. I drove out of LA as the city exhaled its smoggy breath behind me. Hours blurred. Mountains rose like sleeping giants, and trees thickened until they swallowed the sky. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was sinking into something viscous and dark, a space between worlds. Gas stations turned from bright urban beacons to lonely shacks with flickering neon signs. The people became fewer, their eyes either too curious or too indifferent. At a rest stop near Reading, I saw my reflection in the bathroom mirror. My face looked hollow, my eyes red-veined and wide. I looked like a ghost wearing my own skin. I kept driving. Past small logging towns, past abandoned barns with faded Jesus Saves signs, past winding mountain roads that snaked into fog so thick it felt alive. At some point, I realized I hadn't eaten in nearly 24 hours. My stomach felt like a pit, but food seemed irrelevant, like an ancient ritual from a life I no longer belonged to. I slept in the car that night, parked under towering redwoods that creaked in the wind. I woke up to the smell of moss and rain and something else, a sweetness on the air that I couldn't place, something floral, medicinal, and oddly alluring. I was like the force was whispering to me, promising to unravel me in the gentlest, most seductive way possible. As the first light crept over the tree line, I started the engine. The sign read, Morrow Creek, 17 miles. My hands trembled on the steering wheel. I didn't know what awaited me. A part of me didn't care. I had left Lucas Merrick, the designer, the failed lover, the half-alive man, somewhere back on the asphalt miles ago. I drove on, into the fog, into the unknown, into whatever version of myself I might find waiting at the end of this road. Because when everything is gone, your love, your work, your identity, maybe the only thing left worth chasing is a place where you can finally disappear. I never believed in omens before that drive. In LA, omens are just tarot cards and overpriced crystals. They're stickers on yoga water bottles or hashtags on Instagram stories. But on that road into Oregon, the universe stopped whispering and started screaming. The last gas station I hit was a forgotten place clinging to the edge of a cliff. The attendant was an old man with skin like leather and eyes that seemed too bright for his wrinkled face. He watched me the way a stray dog might watch a stranger holding food, equal parts suspicion and hunger. "You headed up toward Morrow Creek?" he asked as I fumbled with my credit card. His voice was rough, like it had been soaked in whiskey and wood smoke for decades. "Yeah," I said. "How'd you know?" He snorted, wiped his hands on a rag that looked dirtier than the ground. "Ain't many folks drive this way. Not unless they got business up there, or something to run from." He didn't wait for my reply, just turned and disappeared behind a curtain of bead strings into a back room. I topped off my tank, listening to the lonely clunk of the pump. Beyond the gas station, the world fell away into mist and pines so tall they looked like they might spear the sky. Every tree branch seemed to beckon or warn. Back on the road, I rolled the window down a few inches. The air smelled wild, earthy, damp, laced with a sweetness that felt both inviting and predatory. Somewhere in the canopy above, birds called out sharp, echoing notes that sounded more like warnings than songs. The further I drove, the more the world behind me disintegrated. My phone lost service miles ago. No notifications, no red dots, no phantom vibrations in my pocket. The silence was absolute. I saw an old barn around mile marker 112. The paint had peeled away in long curling sheets. On its roof, someone had spray painted a phrase in red, almost the same shade as dried blood. "You don't find peace here. It finds you." I kept driving. The fog grew thicker, curling in tendrils across the road like ghostly fingers. Every few miles, I thought I saw figures between the trees, silhouettes just beyond the edge of my headlights, too quick and fluid to be human. I told myself it was sleep deprivation, that I hadn't truly rested in weeks, that the mind plays tricks when it's starved of light and sound and connection. But deep down, something primal in me shivered. My hands clenched the wheel so hard my knuckles bleached white. At one point I pulled over and stepped out. The forest swallowed me instantly. The mist dampened every sound, made me feel like I was standing inside a giant lung, breathing me in, breathing me out. I leaned against the hood, feeling its warmth, and closed my eyes. For a moment, I imagined Sophie standing beside me, her hair whipping in the cold wind, her voice cutting through the fog. "Why are you here, Lucas? What are you really chasing?" I didn't know. Maybe I wanted to disappear into a place so far removed from the world that no one would recognize the hollow shape I had become. Maybe I wanted punishment, or rebirth, or maybe, in the ugliest parts of me, I wanted to become something unrecognizable. A creature in the woods, a whisper in the fog. I opened my eyes to find a crow perched on a low branch no more than 5 feet away. Its feathers were ragged and slick with dew. It stared at me, head cocked, eyes sharp and too human. Then it let out a single harsh caw that felt like it cut straight through my ribs. I stumbled back into the car and slammed the door shut, breath shuddering. When I started the engine again, it roared to life like some old, wounded animal. I kept going. The road narrowed, twisting like an artery deeper into the woods. At the next curve, a sign appeared, wooden and nearly hidden by moss. Morrow Creek Sanctuary, 5 miles. My pulse thundered so loud I thought I might faint. I felt it in my spine first, a humming low vibration that didn't come from the car, like a distant drum echoing beneath the forest floor. I slowed down, the tires crunching over wet gravel. Shapes flickered at the edge of my vision. A girl in a white dress, a hunched figure with 2 long limbs, a man with no face. Every time I turned to look, they dissolved into the mist, but I knew they were there, watching. When I finally saw the gate, I almost kept driving. 2 tall iron doors, flanked by crumbling stone columns overgrown with ivy. A sign, hand-painted in an elegant but faded script. Morrow Creek Sanctuary, where you become whole. I stopped in the middle of the road, heart jackhammering in my chest. I could turn around. I could drive back to the city, to my unpaid bills, to half-empty bars and nameless faces. I could try to stitch my old life together with trembling hands, but my hands stayed frozen on the wheel. The gates creaked open on their own. A surge of cold air rolled out, thick with the smell of sage and something else. Floral, rich, almost intoxicating. I inched forward. The trees inside were thicker, their trunks twisted like dancers mid-twirl, canopies so dense they blocked the weak afternoon light. The road split ahead, lined with dim lanterns that flickered as if they were alive. I rolled to a stop. My breath fogged up the windshield, each exhale louder than a gunshot in that suffocating silence. Then, from the shadows, a figure stepped out. She was tall and lean, wearing a dark wool cloak, silver hair pulled into a tight braid. Her eyes caught the dying light, glittering with a sharp, clinical curiosity. I stepped out, legs jelly beneath me. She tilted her head, as if she were examining a specimen rather than greeting a guest. "Lucas Merrick," she said. Her voice was clear, strong, with the weight of someone who never wasted a word. "Welcome to Morrow Creek." Hearing my name from her mouth felt like a verdict. I wanted to speak, to ask how she knew me, but my tongue felt like a slab of stone. She took a few steps closer. Her presence was magnetic, part mother, part predator. "I'm Adeline," she said. "We've been expecting you." My throat went dry. "Expecting me?" I croaked. Her lips curled into a slight smile, though her eyes stayed cold. "Those who come here don't arrive by accident, Lucas. You've already chosen us. You just didn't know it yet." Something inside me cracked open then, a fault line I didn't know existed. And as I stood there, in the dying light, on the threshold of a place I didn't understand, I realized one truth so sharp it nearly split me in half. I didn't come here to escape my old life. I came here to bury it. Adeline moved like she wasn't touching the ground. Her cloak drifted behind her as if she were underwater, and when she turned to gesture for me to follow, the movement felt rehearsed, precise and ritualistic. I stumbled after her, my boots crunching against the wet gravel, each step echoing too loudly in the heavy air. The gate creaked shut behind us, sealing me inside. I looked back instinctively. The forest beyond the gates had already begun to disappear into the fog. The road I came from felt like a dream, dissolving at sunrise, intangible, unreal. Adeline didn't wait for me to catch up. She led me down a winding path lined with lanterns that glowed with a faint, pulsing light, as though they were breathing. I kept thinking I saw faces in the shadows between the trees. A pale cheek, a glimmer of an eye, a flash of teeth. Every time I blinked, they vanished. "What is this place?" I finally managed to ask, my voice barely more than a tremor. Adeline didn't turn around. "It's a sanctuary," she replied. "A place to shed the pieces of yourself you no longer need." We rounded a curve, and the main lodge appeared out of the mist. It was massive, an old, sprawling structure made of dark timber and heavy stones, moss crawling up its sides like fingers. The windows glowed softly, as if lit by candlelight. The roof sloped steeply, covered in thick green patches where nature had started reclaiming it. I paused, taking it all in. Something ancient clung to the building, something that hummed beneath my skin. Adeline stopped at the base of the steps and turned to face me. Up close, her eyes were even sharper, gray-blue like steel dipped in frost. They locked onto me, dissecting me without mercy. "Lucas," she said, savoring my name. "I need you to understand something before you cross this threshold." I swallowed. My mouth was so dry it felt like swallowing sand. She took a slow step forward. "Everyone who enters Morrow Creek does so by choice. There are no victims here. No one is coerced. Do you understand?" My chest tightened. The logical part of me screamed to run, to turn around, sprint back to the car, and barrel down that twisting road until my old life, no matter how broken, swallowed me up again. But my feet stayed rooted. I nodded. A flicker of satisfaction crossed her face. "Good," she said, "because what happens here cannot be undone. Not by prayer, not by science, not by regret." She turned abruptly and climbed the steps, each footfall echoing in the silent night. I followed, my breath coming fast and shallow. Inside, the air shifted. The warmth hit me first, thick and sweet, saturated with the smell of herbs and something else. Something sharp and floral that stung the inside of my nose. The walls were lined with shelves, stacked with glass bottles, each labeled in a delicate looping script. Some were filled with pale yellow oil, others a dark, almost black liquid that shimmered in the lantern light. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a slow, crackling fire casting long shadows across the room. Dozens of dried herbs hung from the rafters, their brittle leaves rustling like paper when the air moved. Adeline moved with confidence, her hand drifting over the shelves as if greeting old friends. She paused by a large wooden table at the center of the room. It was covered with parchment sheets, glass pipettes, small vials, and copper tools that looked like they belonged in an alchemist's lab. "This is the heart of Morrow Creek," she said softly, almost reverently. "This is where we create the essence that defines us." She looked up at me, her gaze slicing through whatever illusions I might have still been holding. "Do you know why you're here, Lucas?" I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Adeline didn't wait for my answer. "You're here because you're fractured," she continued. "Because something inside you broke so violently that the echoes of that shattering drew you here. We don't choose you, you choose us, through your desperation, your grief, your hunger for something more than the shallow drip feed of modern life." Her words felt like knives gently cutting open my chest. "Here, we refine," she said, picking up a small vial of golden oil. "Just as this oil is distilled from hundreds of petals, we distill the self, purging what is false, keeping what is essential. She moved closer, the vial glinting in the firelight. "Would you like to smell it?" I hesitated, but something deeper than curiosity, something almost magnetic, made me nod. She uncorked the vial and held it beneath my nose. The scent hit me like a tidal wave. Images exploded behind my eyelids. A childhood memory of running through sprinklers on a sun-baked lawn. The weight of Sophie's head on my chest, the first night she stayed over. The smell of my father's old flannel shirt when he hugged me goodbye at college. All of it crashed into me at once. I staggered back, nearly falling. Adeline watched me with a small, knowing smile. "This," she whispered, "is the beginning. You're feeling the fractures pull together and then rip apart again. That's how you know you're ready." My vision swam. I clutched the edge of the table, gasping. She set the vial down and reached for a thick, leather-bound book on a nearby shelf. Its cover was dark and scuffed, the edges warped by time and oil. She opened it, revealing pages of looping handwritten notes and strange diagrams, human silhouettes intersected by lines and circles, markings that looked like constellations mapped onto bodies. "You will need to learn these," she said. "The patterns of transference, the language of essence, the lines between self and other." I stared at the pages, the ink shimmering as if it were alive. "Why me?" I croaked, the question finally breaking free. Adeline tilted her head, her braids slipping over her shoulder like a serpent. "Because you are empty enough to be filled, and brave enough to surrender to it." A single tear slipped down my cheek before I realized it. She closed the book and handed it to me. Its weight was staggering, as if it contained something more than paper and ink. "Rest tonight," she said, her voice softening slightly. "Tomorrow we begin. Once you take the first step, there is no turning back." I took the book in my shaking hands. Adeline turned and glided up a narrow staircase at the far end of the room, her cloak brushing the floor like a whisper. I was left alone, the book heavy in my arms, the scent of the oil still clawing at my mind. I sank into a nearby chair. Through the window, I saw the forest shifting, moving in ways that didn't make sense. Branches curling, shadows bending, shapes slipping between the trees like they were watching me. In that moment, I realized the sanctuary wasn't just a place. It was alive, and it had been waiting for me long before I ever knew it existed. I didn't sleep that first night. After Adeline vanished up the staircase, I stayed frozen in that heavy wooden chair, clutching the leather-bound book like it might slide away if I blinked. Outside, the forest pressed against the windows, a dark ocean of writhing shapes and slow-moving shadows. Every few minutes, I thought I saw a face appear in the glass. Eyes too wide, too bright, features smudged like a painting left out in the rain. When I leaned closer, it dissolved into the blackness. The smell from the oil still clung to my skin. I could taste it on my tongue, feel it sliding down my spine like a cold hand. I thumbed through the book. The pages seemed to shift when I looked at them too long, symbols twitching, ink pooling and curling like smoke. Every diagram felt intimate and violent at the same time, like a surgeon's map of the soul. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps above me, slow, deliberate, like someone pacing in a room just out of reach. Then the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor, followed by a long, strangled creak that seemed to echo down into my teeth. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't stop the noise. If anything, it grew louder, vibrating in my bones rather than my eardrums. I don't know when the noise stopped. At some point, I must have drifted into a shallow, fevered half-sleep because I woke to pale dawn light leaking through the warped glass windows. I stood, legs numb, joints stiff. My head felt swollen with dreams I couldn't remember. I moved to the window and wiped away a thin film of condensation. The forest looked different in daylight. Still dark, still infinite, but less eager to swallow me whole. A low clang startled me. I turned to see Adeline descending the staircase, holding a wide, shallow bowl carved from what looked like blackened oak. Wisps of steam rose from it, carrying a pungent scent somewhere between earth and citrus, like rotting oranges buried in rich soil. She glided across the room and set it on the table. "Breakfast," she announced. Her tone clipped, almost clinical. I stared at the bowl. Inside was a thick, greenish liquid, oily and opaque. "You expect me to eat that?" I croaked. She tilted her head, her braids shifting like a pendulum. "It isn't about expectation," she said. "It's about readiness. The first purge always tastes foul." My stomach turned, but something in her eyes made me sit. I picked up the rough wooden spoon laid beside the bowl and hesitated. "Drink," she commanded. I brought the spoon to my lips. The smell nearly made me gag, but I forced it down. The taste was worse, bitter, metallic, as if I'd licked the inside of an old battery. I gagged, but she didn't flinch. I finished the bowl in shuddering gulps. My eyes watered, sweat beaded on my forehead. My pulse slammed against my skull. "Good," Adeline murmured. "Now we begin." She turned sharply and motioned for me to follow. My vision was already starting to smear at the edges, a shimmering haze pulling at my focus. She led me to a hallway at the back of the lodge. The walls narrowed, the wooden planks twisting and buckling as if they'd grown instead of been built. My fingers brushed against them. They felt warm, almost soft, like animal hide. At the end of the hall stood a heavy iron door. Rust ran down its surface in thick, blackish streaks. Carved into it was the same symbol I'd seen in the book, a circle intersected by an inverted triangle and a jagged line through the center. Adeline produced a massive iron key from her cloak and slid it into the lock. It turned with a groan that rattled up into my spine. When she pushed the door open, a gust of cold air spilled out, carrying with it the scent of sage, mold, and something sweeter, the same floral note I'd smelled that first night, but deeper, almost intoxicating. I stepped forward and looked down. A spiral staircase carved into the stone plunged into darkness. Dim lanterns flickered along the walls, each flame sputtering like a dying breath. Adeline descended without hesitation. Her feet were silent on the steps, her silhouette shrinking with each turn. I followed, gripping the rough, damp railing. Each step felt like I was being pulled deeper into a throat, descending into something that would eventually swallow me whole. As we spiraled down, the air grew denser. My lungs struggled to fill, each breath tasting like old rainwater and iron. My heart pounded so loudly it seemed to echo off the walls. Finally, the stairs opened into a wide underground chamber. The floor was a patchwork of slick stones covered in thin films of moss and dark stains I couldn't identify. Dozens of massive glass containers lined the room, some clear, some clouded with an oily residue. They looked like vats, each as tall as a man bound with dark iron hoops. Strange symbols were carved into their surfaces, and from each one rose a faint, shimmering vapor. My stomach twisted as I realized the shapes moving inside them weren't tricks of the light. They were forms. Limbs pressed against glass, eyes flickering open and closed, mouths frozen mid-scream or mid-laugh. I stumbled backward. "What? What is this?" I choked out. Adeline stood beside one of the containers, resting her palm against the glass. "The essence," she said calmly. "Captured, preserved, refined." I forced my eyes to focus on her. "Those are people." She turned to me, her face softening as if she were explaining something to a child. "They were," she corrected. "Once, but here, they become more. They surrender their fragmented selves to the collective. They dissolve and reform as something beyond flesh, beyond decay." I backed away until my shoulder hit the cold stone wall. My breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. Adeline moved toward me, her steps deliberate. "You came here to be remade, Lucas," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "The oil, the rituals, the descent, these are all just the beginning. You cannot carve out your pain without carving out yourself. You must surrender everything to become truly whole." She reached out and touched my forehead with her fingertips. My vision exploded into flashes of color and sound. Childhood memories, Sophie's face, the smell of hot asphalt in summer, the tremor in my mother's hands the last time I saw her. I gasped, The room swung wildly, spinning like a carousel on fire. "When you wake," Adeline whispered, her voice echoing from somewhere inside my skull, "you will no longer belong to the world above." The last thing I saw was her eyes, wide and shining, two pale stars in the dark. Then everything went black. I woke to a low humming sound. At first I thought it was my own pulse reverberating in my skull, but as I strained to listen, I realized it was coming from everywhere, the walls, the floor, the very air trembling with it. I opened my eyes. I was lying on a rough stone slab, slick with condensation. My skin stuck to it in places, leaving behind smears of sweat and oil. Above me, the cavern ceiling arched into darkness, carved with endless symbols that seemed to shift and crawl whenever I blinked. I tried to sit up, but a sharp pain shot through my temples, pinning me down. I gasped, feeling the world ripple around me. That was when I heard it, a whisper. Faint at first, like someone speaking through a wall of water. Then another, and another. Soon a chorus of disembodied voices flooded the chamber, overlapping, echoing in impossible directions. "He's awake. Can you feel it? The fracture opening? So hungry, so ready." I clawed at the edges of the slab, trying to pull myself upright. My muscles responded sluggishly, as if moving underwater. Finally, I managed to swing my legs over the edge and stand, swaying like a drunk on a storm-tossed ship. The chamber was bigger than I had realized. The vats loomed around me, each one glowing faintly from within. I could see shapes pressing against the glass, hands, faces, silhouettes that shifted like sea creatures in a tank. Some of them moved with frantic urgency, others simply drifted, lost in private dreams or nightmares. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me, threading through my hair, sliding under my skin. Lucas Merrick. The sound of my name nearly buckled my knees. I stumbled forward, clutching at one of the iron hoops encircling a vat. The glass was warm, vibrating with the same low hum that seemed to resonate inside my bones. For a split second, I saw a face on the other side, battling, a man, eyes wide and glassy, his mouth forming a silent scream. His fingers clawed against the glass as if he were trying to break free. Then he vanished into the oily depths. I gagged, bile rising up my throat, but nothing came out. My body felt emptied out, as if they had scraped me clean while I slept. A sudden sharp click echoed through the chamber. I spun around. Adeline stood in the archway, her cloak darker than the shadows behind her. For she held a lantern, its flame green and thin, casting sickly patterns across the walls. Her eyes found mine, calm and unblinking. "The voices are welcoming you," she said, her tone eerily gentle. "You can hear them now, can't you?" I tried to speak, but the words tangled in my throat like barbed wire. Adeline stepped closer, the lantern throwing her face into alternating planes of light and darkness. "This is the true language of the sanctuary," she continued, her voice a soft purr. "Not words on paper or symbols in books, but the language of essence. The song of what remains when flesh is stripped away." She gestured toward the vats, her fingers long and pale. "Each of them once stood where you are now, lost, fractured, yearning to dissolve. They surrendered to the collective, to the communion." I shook my head, backing away until I hit cold stone. I didn't ask for this," I rasped, my voice echoing in the hollow of my chest. Adeline's face softened, almost maternal. "Ah, Lucas," she sighed. "You asked the moment you stepped beyond those gates. You asked when you chose to flee your broken life, to abandon your old skin. You asked when you let the oil touch you." The whispers surged, 1,000 voices, laughing and crying all at once. "He belongs to us. Drink, breathe, surrender." I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't outside. They were inside, threaded through my blood, clinging to every nerve. Adeline moved forward again, so close I could feel the lantern's heat on my cheek. "Tonight, we deepen the fracture," she said, her eyes gleaming. "Tonight, you listen." She raised her free hand and pressed her palm against my chest. A white-hot shock coursed through me. My back arched, my teeth clacked together so hard I thought they'd shatter. The air left my lungs in a ragged scream. My vision split into jagged shards. I saw Sophie, her back turned to me as she disappeared into a doorway bathed in red light. I saw my childhood bedroom, wallpaper peeling, my mother's voice calling me for dinner in a language I no longer understood. I saw myself, floating above my own body, watching with cold reptilian fascination. When I came to, I was on my knees. My forehead rested against the cold stone floor. The chamber was silent now. The whispers receded like a tide. Adeline stood over me, her hand still hovering inches above my skin. "Rise," she commanded softly. I pushed myself upright. Every joint felt like it was filled with gravel, every breath a struggle. But when I met her gaze, I felt something shift inside me, a dark thread snapping free. She turned and gestured toward a narrow corridor at the back of the chamber. "It's time for you to meet the hallowed ground," she said. "The place where the essence is born, where it breathes before it finds its new vessels." I staggered forward, each step harder than the last. The corridor felt alive, the walls pulsed, faint light moving under the surface like blood under skin. At the end was a heavy curtain of deep green velvet, stained in places with blackish streaks. The scent coming from beyond it was overpowering, sweet, cloying, almost narcotic. Adeline pulled the curtain aside and I stepped through. I almost fell to my knees again. The room beyond was circular, its walls lined with hundreds of small glass bottles, each one glowing faintly. In the center stood a massive basin carved from stone, filled with a thick, shimmering liquid that seemed to swirl on its own accord. Shapes moved just beneath the surface. Delicate hands, pale faces, eyes opening and closing slowly like sea anemones. Adeline came up beside me and dipped her fingers into the basin. She pulled them out glistening, and before I could react, she pressed them against my lips. The taste flooded me instantly. Flowers, salt, ash, honey, and blood. My legs gave out, and I collapsed against the rim of the basin. "Welcome," she whispered in my ear, her breath cold and electric. "Welcome to the heart of the sanctuary." I tried to scream, but all that came out was a broken gasp. Because in that moment I realized something far worse than death. I wanted it. I wanted to dissolve. I wanted to vanish into the whispers, into the collective, into the essence, and they knew it. The liquid from the basin clung to my lips like a second skin. I wiped at my mouth with the back of my hand, but the taste only spread, seeping into every corner of my tongue, under my gums, down my throat. Adeline stood over me, her fingers still wet, gleaming in the lantern light like tiny blades. "Don't fight it," she murmured. "The essence knows you better than you know yourself." I crawled backward on my elbows, heels skidding over the slick stone floor. My breath came in ragged pulls. The whispers returned, louder than before, crashing over me like waves against jagged rock. "Lucas, Lucas, come home." I slammed my palms over my ears, but the voices didn't come from outside. They throbbed in my skull, licked the edges of my thoughts, slithered between the cracks of every buried memory. I saw flashes, Sophie crying on the balcony at dawn, my father's disappointed eyes when I dropped out of architecture school, the first time I saw my reflection and didn't recognize it. Adeline stepped closer. I pressed myself against the cold curve of the basin, every muscle screaming. "Why are you so afraid to become?" she asked softly, as if consoling a child afraid of the dark. "You have carried all your broken pieces for so long. Why not let them melt away?" I wanted to curse her, to spit the words out like venom, but my throat refused to obey. Adeline turned, dipping both hands into the basin now. The liquid rippled violently, as if alive, tiny shapes moving beneath the surface, reaching for her wrists. When she pulled her hands out, the substance clung to her fingers in thick strands that writhed and shimmered. She knelt before me, bringing her hands to my face. "Look!" she commanded. I tried to shut my eyes, but they stayed open, locked on hers. She pressed her fingers to my cheeks. The sensation was instant, a burning, freezing flood that shot through my skull, down my spine, out to my fingertips and toes. My limbs convulsed, my jaw cracked open in a silent scream. Then the visions came. I was standing in a sunlit orchard. Warm air, the hum of bees, the sweetness of ripe fruit. Then, all at once, the sky went black. Trees curled in on themselves, trunks snapping like bones, fruit rotting and collapsing in on the earth. I was underwater, lungs screaming for air, my limbs moving too slow. A figure floating just above me. Sophie, hair fanned out like seaweed, her eyes open but unseeing. I was inside my childhood home, but the walls were flesh, throbbing, slick. Doors opened and closed on their own, whispering my name in 100 different voices. I saw myself in a mirror, but the reflection was wrong. Skin rippling, eyes black pits, mouth stretched too wide, teeth chattering in a rhythm that matched the hum in my skull. I fell forward onto all fours, retching. A thin, translucent fluid splattered onto the floor. It smelled like roses and decay. Adeline's hands dropped from my face. She stood, towering above me like a monument carved from moonlight and nightmares. "You are nearly ready," she said. Her voice was calm, almost proud. I collapsed onto my side, sweat slicking my skin. My chest rose and fell in sharp, uneven jerks. My fingers clawed at the stone, leaving shallow scrapes. The whispers receded slightly, like a tide pulling away but promising to return. Adeline turned and walked to the far side of the room, where a heavy wooden door waited. Strange symbols, the same ones from the book, had been burned into its surface. She pushed it open without effort, revealing a narrow passageway beyond. "Come," she called without turning. I didn't want to move. Every nerve screamed for escape, but my body obeyed her voice like a puppet on invisible strings. I pushed myself upright, stumbled after her through the door. The passage twisted sharply, sloping downward. Roots jutted from the walls like skeletal fingers. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of wet earth and something electric, like the sharp tang of ozone before a lightning strike. We emerged into another chamber, smaller and almost womb-like. Candles lined the walls, their flames casting shuddering shadows that looked like dancing specters. In the center sat a low stone altar covered in black velvet, with a single glass vial resting atop it. Adeline moved behind the altar, lifting the vial with reverence. Inside swirled a viscous fluid, darker than anything I had seen, almost black, with shimmering veins of deep crimson that pulsed as if alive. "The first true communion," she whispered. I stumbled closer, drawn despite the horror pooling in my gut. The vial seemed to vibrate in her hands, calling to me. "Drink," she commanded, extending it toward me. I shook my head, stepping back, but the room shifted. The walls bulged inward, shadows crawling closer, whispering louder. "Drink, drink, drink." Adeline's eyes bore into mine. "You cannot run from yourself forever, Lucas," she said. Her words felt like claws tearing open my ribs. "There is no healing without dissolution, no rebirth without death." My knees buckled. I fell forward, catching myself on the altar. The vial hovered inches from my face. The scent hit me, rich, almost sweet, laced with something metallic and primal. I felt hands on my shoulders, pressing me down. Invisible hands. The voices rose into a frenzied chorus. "Take us in! Let us in! We will make you whole!" I reached for the vial, tears streaming down my face, my fingers wrapped around the cold glass. "Please, stop," I sobbed, my voice a broken whimper swallowed by the whispers. But my hand lifted, bringing the vial to my lips. The moment the liquid touched my tongue, a scream tore from my throat, echoing into the endless dark. A scream not just of terror, but of something deeper. A grief so vast it could split the earth. A relief so raw, it flayed me open from the inside. I drank. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was Adeline's face, serene and luminous, her lips mouthing words I could no longer hear. Then I was gone. When I woke, the world was gone. At least, the world I knew. The rigid lines, the sharp edges, the stubborn certainty of gravity and flesh. I was floating in a space that felt both infinite and impossibly small, like I'd been shrunk into a single cell and expanded across an entire galaxy at the same time. My thoughts weren't my own anymore. They drifted through me like strangers, echoing in a language I recognized but couldn't translate. Sophie's face flickered past, her lips mouthing something I couldn't hear. My father's silhouette, standing in a doorway, head shaking in disappointment. My mother's laughter, sharp and fleeting, like the crack of a match. Then other faces, dozens, hundreds, eyes opening and closing, mouths stretching too wide, chanting in unison. "Welcome, welcome, become." The voices rose and fell in waves, crashing over me, pulling at whatever remained of my sense of self. I wanted to scream, but there was no mouth, no air, no sound, just vibration. Then a hand. Pale, thin fingers, nails painted the color of ash. It reached through the void and pressed against my forehead. Suddenly I felt my body again, heavy, trembling, bones creaking like old timber. I gasped, my first breath tasting like copper and wildflowers. I was lying on the cold stone floor of the small chamber. My skin was slick with sweat, and I realized with a start that the sweat smelled sweet. Not like salt or fear, but like syrup and honey and something floral that clung to the back of my throat. I forced my eyes open. Adeline knelt above me, her expression radiant and terrifying all at once. "You've crossed the threshold," she whispered. Her voice sounded layered, as though dozens of voices spoke through her at once, each one echoing in a different corner of my skull. I tried to sit up, my arms barely obeyed, shaking violently. Adeline steadied me, her hands cold and firm. "Breathe," she instructed. "Let it move through you." I inhaled, and the scent that filled me was so strong it felt like it might choke me. Jasmine, decaying leaves, burnt sugar, and iron. The whispers returned, but now they felt different, closer, more intimate, like a lover's breath against my ear. "You are part of us now." Adeline's eyes shimmered with something like pride. "Most resist," she said, almost to herself. "They vomit, they scream, they claw at the walls until their fingers bleed, but you accepted." I didn't know whether to laugh or weep. My mouth twitched, but no sound came. She helped me to my feet. The room spun violently, and I had to clutch her arm to stay upright. "Come," she said, "it's time to see." She guided me back through the twisting passageway, the shadows licking at my ankles, shapes shifting along the walls as if they were alive and watching. When we reached the main underground chamber, I staggered forward and nearly collapsed again. The vats. They glowed now, brighter than before, each one pulsing in a slow, synchronized rhythm. Inside, the shapes no longer drifted aimlessly. They moved with purpose, pressing against the glass, fingers trailing symbols, eyes staring directly at me. My breath caught. I felt a pressure inside my head, as if something was crawling behind my eyes. Adeline stepped to the nearest vat and pressed her palm against it. The liquid inside shimmered, and a shape floated forward. A woman, hair fanning around her head like seaweed, eyes milky and endless. "This is Eleanor," Adeline said softly. "She came here 20 years ago. A violinist, broken by grief after losing her child." Eleanor's pale hands flattened against the glass, her face splitting into a wide, serene smile. "She surrendered everything," Adeline continued. "Now she is essence, knowledge, memory. She teaches us patience." Adeline moved to another vat, beckoning me to follow. Beside this one, a man floated, muscles tense, jaw clenched, tattoos twisted across his skin, warping with the movement of the liquid. "Marcus," she said, "an MMA fighter, filled with rage, shame, the need to destroy and be destroyed. Here his aggression has been refined into pure discipline. He strengthens us." I wanted to turn away, but my feet refused. We moved from vat to vat, each time Adeline introduced a new form, a new soul, each with a story of pain, loss, hunger, and each one now part of a vast collective that hummed just beneath my skin. As I watched, I realized I could hear them. Not just as whispers, but as clear individual thoughts, weaving together into a single, endless tapestry. Lucas, Lucas. My name rippled from vat to vat, echoing in the liquid, vibrating in my bones. I dropped to my knees, clutching my head. You are us. We are you. Welcome home. Adeline knelt beside me, her hands sliding into my hair, fingers curling at my scalp. You feel it now, she said. Her breath was hot in my ear. The collective, the communion. You are no longer alone in your grief, your failures, your guilt. All of that belongs to us now, I sobbed, a broken, childlike sound that seemed to come from a place deeper than my lungs. Adeline shushed me gently, rocking me like a mother. This is the price of wholeness, she whispered. This is the unveiling, the stripping away of illusion. My eyes darted around the chamber. The vats blurred and shifted until they looked like windows into an infinite sea of faces, each one reaching toward me, beckoning. I felt the warmth bloom in my chest, then spread, a slow, glowing tendril of something that wasn't mine. Take us, hold us, just become the vessel. I wanted to fight it, but even as I thought that, another part of me, the deeper, hidden part, welcomed it. The warmth spread to my shoulders, down my arms, through my fingertips, all the way to my toes. I felt my skin tremble, as if something inside was pushing out, trying to break free. I tilted my head back and let out a long, shuddering breath. Adeline pulled away slightly to look at me. Her eyes sparkled with something almost like tears. It's beautiful, isn't it? She whispered. The moment you realize you are no longer just you. I couldn't answer. My mouth hung open, my vision pulsed with 1,000 flickering images. Adeline pressed her forehead to mine, and in that contact I felt a surge of thoughts, not just hers, but everyone's, the entire sanctuary pouring into me like a flood through a broken dam. Lucas! 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 And somewhere, beneath it all, I felt a single, razor-thin shard of myself. A flicker of defiance. A tiny ember glowing in the dark. But before I could reach it, the voices swallowed me whole. I don't know how long I knelt there. Time had unraveled. Seconds smeared into hours. Hours into a single, endless moment that pulsed like a living wound. The voices inside me rose and fell like a tide, sometimes so loud I felt my skull might crack open. Other times soft and seductive, whispering half-memories in a language that felt older than my bones. Adeline remained close, her breath warm against my ear, her forehead pressed to mine. Her fingers wove through my hair, tightening just enough to keep me tethered to her when the pull of the collective threatened to rip me under completely. Stay with me, she murmured. Feel them, but don't lose yourself. Not yet. I wanted to ask what she meant, to scream, to demand she let me go, but my tongue felt like it had been torn out and replaced with something soft and useless. Images continued to flood my mind. A woman's hands shaping wet clay on a wheel. A child's open-mouthed wail as a fever burned under candlelight. Fists pounding on a church door during a thunderstorm. Then they shifted. I saw Adeline, years younger, her hair jet black and her face untouched by lines. She stood before the same basin of essence, her eyes wide with terror and wonder. Hands, dozens of them, reached for her from the liquid, caressing her cheeks, pulling at her wrists, welcoming her into their embrace. I felt her fear, her exhilaration, her surrender. This is how I began, she whispered, her voice now echoing inside my head as much as in my ear. I was like you, broken, frantic, clawing at the walls of my own skin, but they found me. They pieced me together from my own wreckage. I tried to recoil, but her fingers curled tighter in my hair, holding me in place. Lucas, she breathed, and my name vibrated through the marrow of my bones. You don't understand yet. You are not simply being changed, you are being refined. The Lucas you were, the designer, the broken lover, the drifter, he was a rough sketch. We are the hand shaping you into something final. something true. Her words dripped into me like hot wax. I felt a flicker, that tiny ember of defiance from before try to flare again, but a dozen voices pressed against it, smothering it under gentle, inexorable weight. I gasped, tears flooding my eyes. Surrender, breathe us in, let us finish you. The whispers coiled around my ribs, snaked down my spine, my body shuddered violently. Adeline pulled back just enough to look into my eyes. Hers glowed with a light that wasn't entirely hers. If you keep fighting, you will shatter, she warned softly. You will become nothing but a mindless echo drifting in the vats forever. Is that what you want? I tried to form a thought, but each one dissolved before it could finish. She brought her palm to my cheek, thumb brushing across my lips. Good, she said when I didn't answer. You're ready. She stood, pulling me to my feet with her. My knees buckled, but she held me upright, guiding me like a mother teaching a newborn to walk. We moved through the chamber, past the glowing vats. The shapes inside pressed closer to the glass as we passed, their movements becoming more frantic, more eager. Hands slapped softly against the barrier, leaving shimmering prints that slowly faded. Come join, come join, come join. Adeline led me to a narrow stairway at the far end of the chamber. Unlike the others, this one climbed upward, disappearing into darkness overhead. This is the sanctum, she said, where the collective's will is given form, where your final choice awaits. I tried to pull back, but my limbs moved in jerky, puppet-like spasms. My feet obeyed her gentle nudges more than my own mind. We ascended slowly. The air grew warmer, thicker, filled with the heavy perfume of the essence. My lungs burned with every breath. At the top, we entered a wide circular room, the ceiling arched high above, vanishing into darkness. In the center sat a large stone pedestal, its surface covered in carvings that looked like veins, or roots, or the branching paths of neurons. A shallow bowl rested atop it, filled with the same dark, shimmering fluid I had tasted before, but this time it seemed to glow from within, pulsing gently as if it were alive and breathing. Adeline released me. I nearly collapsed, but managed to brace myself against the pedestal. This is where each vessel is completed, she explained, her voice soft, reverent. This is where you choose to either become part of us fully or dissolve into the echo. I shook my head weakly. My voice finally clawed its way back up my throat, ragged and thin. I don't want this. Adeline tilted her head. Don't you? She asked, her eyes narrowing. Didn't you come here to lose yourself? To shed your pain? Your failures? To escape the hollow life you so desperately hated? The words struck me like hammer blows. You wanted this, the collective whispered in unison, echoing her accusation. I fell to my knees, gripping the pedestal, my forehead pressed against its cold surface. Inside my mind, that last ember of self sputtered and sparked, fighting to stay alive under the crushing weight of 1,000 foreign voices. You are one of us. There is no Lucas. Only the vessel, only the whole. I felt the warmth spread again, coiling around that ember, suffocating it with terrifying tenderness. Adeline stepped forward, her bare feet soundless on the stone. She crouched in front of me, her fingers tilting my chin up until my eyes met hers. Drink, she whispered. Choose, this is your final act of will. I stared at her. My body trembled violently, caught between two tidal forces, the urge to surrender completely and the primal animal instinct to survive as something, anything, apart from them. My hand rose, fingers curling around the edge of the bowl. Yes, yes, yes. The whispers became a single thunderous pulse, a heartbeat that seemed to echo through the walls and into the marrow of my bone. I pulled the bowl closer. The liquid surface trembled, reflecting my twisted, half-erased face. For a single breathless second I hesitated, and in that pause, I felt it, the last fragile flicker of Lucas Merrick, a single dying star in an infinite night sky. I watched my own reflection ripple across the surface of the bowl. At first, it looked like me, the me who had arrived in Oregon broken and desperate. The me who had once dreamed of becoming an architect before I settled for making logos for holobrands. The me who had clung to Sophie like she might save me from myself. But then the reflection twisted. My eyes became bottomless pits, black and hungry. My skin sagged and writhed, as if something beneath it was trying to claw its way out. My mouth split open too wide, a gaping grin full of jagged, shifting teeth. The room trembled. Adeline's fingers tightened on my shoulders, her nails digging deep enough to draw blood. "Drink," she hissed, her voice now layered with dozens of others, male and female, young and ancient, all echoing inside my skull. "Finish what you came here for." I wanted to throw the bowl across the room, to shatter it and watch the essence flood the floor, to drown the whispers and wash my mind clean, but my hands betrayed me. They lifted the bowl slowly, reverently, as if guided by strings. Good, good, almost home. The liquid scent hit me first, heady, floral, almost intoxicating. But underneath it was something darker, a rank undercurrent like rotting flesh. My stomach heaved, but I couldn't stop. I pressed the rim to my lips. The liquid touched my tongue, thick and viscous, sliding down my throat like molten glass. A scream tore from my lungs. Not a scream of pain, but of annihilation, of something primal and final, echoing up from a depth I didn't know existed inside me. The liquid seared through me, each drop igniting trails of fire that raced through my veins. My limbs flailed, muscles spasming violently. I felt my mind splinter, shards of memory shattering and spinning away like leaves in a hurricane. I saw my mother's face the night she told me my father had left. The first time Sophie looked at me with that soft, dangerous pity, the countless mornings I woke up feeling like a stranger in my own skin. Each image was torn away, consumed by the voices. "We take your sorrow, we take your shame, we take your fear." The warmth became a flood, surging past my ribs, bursting behind my eyes. I fell backward, the bowl crashing to the floor beside me, splattering thick black liquid across the stone. Adeline knelt over me, her hair loose now, falling around her face like a silver curtain. Her eyes glowed with impossible light. "You're beautiful," she whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks. "You are almost complete." I couldn't see. My vision strobed with colors I didn't have names for. Violent greens, searing whites, colors that felt like they were eating holes in my brain. My hands clawed at my chest, nails ripping skin, trying to find that last flicker of me. That ember. Let it go, let it go, let it go. The voices circled me, pressed against me, crawled into me. I felt the embers sputter, falter, almost snuffed out. I thought of the smell of wet asphalt after summer rain, the sting of whiskey on a raw throat at 3 a.m. The warmth of Sophie's forehead resting against mine as she mumbled half-asleep apologies for nightmares I never understood. That ember flared, bright enough to blind me from the inside out. I screamed again, this time a sound that split the room like a lightning strike. The vats below roared an answer, shapes slamming against the glass, liquid boiling and churning. Adeline staggered back, her face twisted in something between awe and horror. "No," she whispered. "You must surrender. You cannot carry the fracture alone." I forced myself to my knees, blood dripping from my torn chest, essence oozing down my lips. I looked at her, and for the first time she looked small, human, mortal. "I am not yours," I rasped. My voice sounded like gravel dragged across steel, but it was mine, Adeline screamed, a sharp, inhuman wail that shook the walls. The room began to collapse in on itself, shadows unraveling, lantern flames flaring and dying. From the vats below, the collective shrieked, a tidal wave of agony and rage. "Come back. You are us. You are us." I pushed myself upright, muscles spasming, bones creaking under the strain. My feet found the ground, shaky but still mine. The corridor beyond the sanctum flickered, walls twisting and tearing like wet paper. I ran. Each step felt like my body might shatter into dust, but I kept moving. My hands slammed into walls that seemed to breathe. My feet slid over floors that pulsed under me. I burst back into the main chamber. The vats thrashed violently, shapes clawing at the glass, liquid spilling in thin black streams across the floor. Lucas. Lucas. I stumbled past them, ignoring the chorus. My head throbbed with every heartbeat, the ember now a raging fire that roared in my veins. I reached the stairs and clawed my way up, scraping skin, leaving smears of blood and essence behind me. I could hear Adeline below, her voice cracking, calling my name, no longer the cool command, but a desperate, broken plea. "Lucas! You can't leave! You are nothing without us!" I didn't look back. I exploded through the final door into the hallway above. The air hit me like a slap, cold, sharp, real. The walls no longer shifted. The scent of the essence receded, replaced by the raw smell of night air leaking in from somewhere beyond. I stumbled forward, gripping the railing, my vision flickering like a dying candle. Somewhere deep inside, I felt the collective's last grip loosening. Voices sputtered, faded, dissolving into static. I didn't know if I was free. I didn't know if I would ever truly be Lucas Merrick again. But in that moment, that one breath, that one fractured heartbeat, I was more myself than I had been in years, and that, for now, was enough. The hallway felt endless. Every step echoed, sharp and metallic, reverberating through the wooden ribs of the lodge like a scream stuck in a throat. I stumbled forward, leaving smears of blood and black essence on the walls, like some wounded animal trying to claw its way out of a nightmare. My lungs burned. Each breath tasted like rust and flowers, the last ghosts of the essence still clinging to my insides. I rounded a corner and nearly collapsed. There it was, the main lodge foyer. The heavy timber beams overhead seemed to bend under some invisible weight, their edges shimmering slightly as though the air itself was rippling. The big front doors loomed ahead, half open, letting in thin slices of moonlight. I staggered toward them, my legs wobbling like they were made of wet paper. Then I heard it, a chorus of voices rising from below, muffled but furious, a collective shriek that scraped along my spine and threatened to pull me back down into the depths. "Lucas! Lucas, come back! You are us! You belong here!" I turned to look behind me. Shadows moved in the corridor. They crawled up the walls, pooling at the ceiling, stretching long fingers across the floor. Shapes began to pull themselves free, half-formed figures, eyes wide and mouths open in soundless cries. Adeline's voice soared above them all, ragged and unhinged. "Lucas, you think you can run? You think you can carry that ember alone? You are hollow. You are ours." The shadows lunged. I pushed forward, feet slipping on the polished wood. My hands slammed into the heavy doors. I shoved them open with every ounce of strength left in me. Cold night air punched me in the face, sharp and electric. I gasped as though I'd been underwater for years. Outside, the moon glared down from a star-choked sky. The forest pressed close around the clearing, trees rising like dark cathedral pillars. The gravel driveway twisted away into the darkness, my only possible escape route. I ran. Branches slapped at my face and arms as I stumbled through the tree line. My shoes caught on roots and rocks, sending me sprawling more than once, but I crawled back to my feet each time. Behind me, the collective roared. The forest itself seemed to shudder, leaves vibrating with their voices. "Lucas! Lucas! Lucas!" I crashed through a thicket, thorns tearing into my arms, and burst onto the dirt driveway. My heart pounded so violently it felt like it might punch through my ribs. Somewhere in the distance, I saw the faint shape of my car, parked and forgotten under a thick layer of pine needles and moss. I limped toward it, each step a battle. My vision swam. The edges of the world curled inward, threatening to collapse like a dying star. I fumbled the door open and fell inside. My shaking hands clawed at the keys in my pocket. When the engine finally sputtered to life, a sob tore out of me. I slammed it into reverse, tires spitting gravel. The headlights sliced through the trees like knives. Then I saw her. Adeline stood in the driveway, framed by moonlight and fog. Her hair blew around her face, wild and silver, her cloak billowing like torn wing. Her eyes locked on mine, furious, pleading, almost sorrowful. She raised her hand, and for a moment I felt something inside me waver. A pull, deep and instinctual, like gravity itself trying to bend me back toward her. "You can't escape what you are," she screamed, her voice twisting into 1,000 overlapping echoes. "You will always hear us. You will always belong to us." I hit the gas. The car lurched backward, then spun as I cranked the wheel, spraying dirt and pine needles. I sped down the driveway, branches whipping against the doors and roof. The forest closed in around me, but I didn't slow down. The moon flickered between tree trunks like a strobe light. In the rearview mirror, I saw Adeline shrinking into the distance. Her arms were still outstretched, her mouth open in a soundless wail. Shadows churned around her feet, clawing upward like a black tide. As I tore down the final stretch of road, the whispers inside me surged one last time. "Lucas, please, stay. You are incomplete without us. We are your family." I slammed my fist into the steering wheel, bellowing into the windshield. "I am not yours." The whispers shivered, crackled, and for a moment, I thought they might flood back in. But the ember, that tiny, impossible flame, flared again, hotter than ever. And then, silence. It wasn't complete. In the pit of my skull, I could still feel a faint hum, like a distant power line at night. But it was mine now. Contained, contested. The road widened. I saw the highway signs ahead, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Civilization. A promise of people, noise, and a world that felt alien and necessary all at once. I pulled onto the main road, the car bucking under me, tires squealing. As I drove, I felt my breathing begin to steady. My pulse slowed, though my hands still trembled against the wheel. I didn't know where I was going. Maybe north, maybe east, anywhere that wasn't Morrow Creek. Anywhere I could pretend the forest wasn't waiting just beyond the next turn. I glanced at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face looked older, hollower. My eyes, though, they burned with something new, something raw and angry and desperately alive. For the first time in what felt like lifetimes, I realized I was crying, not from fear, but from something else. Relief, grief, a strange, sharp joy that cut deeper than any blade. I drove until the sun started clawing its way up the horizon, smearing the sky in bruised purples and reds. In the half-light of dawn, the forest finally fell away behind me, and I promised myself, even if the whispers came back, even if I carried them like a scar inside my mind forever, I would never, ever go back. I didn't know who I would become, or what pieces of me would survive tomorrow, but as I sped down that lonely highway, I knew one thing with ferocious certainty. For this one sunrise at least, I was free. I don't remember how many hours I drove that day. I just know that I kept going, mile after mile, tank after tank. I passed towns so small they didn't even bother with welcome signs, gas stations with broken neon lights, buzzing like dying wasps, rusted mailboxes, standing like gravestones on empty roads. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't sleep. I didn't let myself look in the mirrors for too long. At some point, I found a run-down motel, the kind with chipped turquoise paint and faded vacancy signs that flickered when the wind blew. I pulled in, hands trembling so badly I almost dropped the keys twice before I managed to kill the engine. The clerk behind the counter didn't even lift his eyes when I asked for a room. He pushed a key toward me with the same flat indifference as a man handing out funeral pamphlets. Room 12. The door stuck when I pushed it open. Inside, the air smelled like old cigarettes and mildew. The bedspread was a violent floral pattern, probably unchanged since the 80s. I collapsed onto the mattress, fully clothed, shoes still caked in mud and blood. My eyelids felt like they'd been sandpapered, my entire body buzzing with 1,000 phantom insects. For a moment, I thought I might finally sleep, but then the whisper came. "Lucas. Lucas, are you alone now?" I jolted upright, breath hitching, heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. I scanned the room, The sagging curtains, the cracked TV screen, the warped dresser mirror, empty. Did you really think you could run? I pressed my palms to my temples, digging my fingers into the skin. Get out, I rasped. Get the fuck out of my head. A soft laugh, echoing from everywhere and nowhere. We were never just in your head. I doubled over, a dry heave racking my stomach. Nothing came up, just bile and air and that heavy, cloying floral scent that had soaked into my bones. I staggered into the bathroom. The mirror above the sink was fogged with grime, but I could still make out my outline. My face looked hollowed, like something had scooped me out from the inside and left a fragile husk. My eyes were sunken and ringed in dark bruises, but they burned with something sharp and defiant. Something that refused to die. You're not real, I hissed at my own reflection. You're not fucking real. But even as I said it, I saw the edges of my face ripple, like water disturbed by a falling stone. A second reflection flickered behind mine, pale, hair drifting as if underwater, eyes wide and unblinking. Elena, the violinist. Her mouth opened, but no sound came. I stumbled back, knocking into the shower curtain. The rings screeched along the rod, metal clashing like a scream. I fell to the floor, knees cracking against tile. The smell of mildew and old soap hit me, grounding me in that cheap, shitty bathroom. I pressed my forehead to the cold tiles, sobbing. We are still with you. We are you. I wanted to tear my skull open just to scrape them out, to reach in with shaking fingers and pull every last voice, every last flicker of them away until only I remained. But I couldn't. I crawled back to the bed, each movement a battle. My muscles twitched uncontrollably, as if they weren't sure whose commands to obey. I curled up on the mattress, fists clenched so tight my nails bit into my palms. You can never truly escape the essence. Once it finds a vessel, it lingers forever. I thought about Adeline, her face illuminated in moonlight as she called to me in the driveway. The raw desperation in her voice. I thought about the vats, those flickering shapes pressing against the glass, pleading, howling, welcoming. A violent shiver racked my spine. I had escaped the sanctuary, yes. I had escaped the ritual, the basin, the final communion. But they had left something inside me, a splinter, a dark seed. Lucas, come back. Come home. We are your only family now. I pressed my palms harder against my ears. My throat burned as I forced myself to whisper, over and over. No, 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 no. Each repetition felt weaker than the last. I don't know how long I lay there, maybe hours, maybe just minutes that stretched out like an endless tunnel. When I finally forced my eyes open again, it was dark outside. The neon sign buzzed beyond the window, its light crawling across the ceiling like a restless spirit. I sat up slowly, every joint protesting. My clothes clung to me, soaked in sweat and essence and blood. I stumbled to the tiny motel desk and grabbed the brittle notepad left beside a crusty pen. My hand shook violently as I pressed the pen down, the ink skipping across the page. If you find this, don't go to Morrow Creek. Don't follow the signs. Don't listen to the whispers in the trees. Burn this if you can. Forget my name, forget this story. Please. My vision blurred. I thought I could run. I thought I could be free, but they are inside me, and they are patient. I dropped the pen. It clattered to the floor, rolling under the bed. I dragged myself to the window, peeking past the curtains into the night. For a moment, everything was still, quiet. Then I saw it. A figure standing under the flickering motel sign. Tall, draped in a dark cloak, silver hair spilling over her shoulders, gleaming in the neon light. Adeline. She stood perfectly still, her face hidden in shadow, but I could feel her eyes on me, burrowing through the glass, through the wall, straight into the raw, quivering center of me. My mouth went dry, my knees buckled. We are waiting, Lucas. We always will be. I slammed the curtain shut, stumbling back. My chest heaved, each breath jagged and wet. I pressed my back against the wall, sliding down until I hit the floor. Outside, the sign continued to buzz and flicker, spelling out VAC, NCY in broken pulses. Inside, I curled in on myself, every cell in my body humming with their presence. I realized then that the sanctuary had never been a place. It had always been a door, and once opened, it could never truly be closed again. And now, they were here, with me, forever. I don't remember falling asleep. Maybe I didn't. Maybe I just slipped into some half-world between waking and dreaming. That thin membrane where everything is sharp and hungry, and realer than reality. I opened my eyes to total darkness. The neon glow outside had vanished, swallowed by a thick, pulsing black that pressed against the motel windows like a living thing. My chest rose and fell too fast. Each breath sounded like it was echoing off distant canyon walls. My ears rang with a high, static hum, the kind that worms its way under your skin and gnaws at the base of your skull. I tried to sit up, but my limbs felt heavy, weighted down by something unseen. Then I heard it. A low, rhythmic knock at the door. 3 taps. Slow, deliberate. I froze. The knock came again. 3 taps. Each one heavier than the last, reverberating through the floor and up into my teeth. I forced myself to stand. My knees buckled. My hands fumbled along the wall, searching for the lamp. When my fingers found the switch, I snapped it on. Nothing. I flicked it again and again, but the bulb stayed dead, leaving the room in a suffocating shadow. "Lucas, open the door." The voice slid under the door. The voice slid into the doorframe, curling into the room like smoke. It was Adeline's voice, but layered, dozens of voices woven together into a single, monstrous chord. I staggered back, bumping into the dresser. The mirror rattled, reflecting a warped, quivering shape I barely recognized as myself. "No," I whispered, my voice cracking. "You're not real. You can't be here." "We have always been here. You carried us with you when you ran." The handle turned slowly. Metal groaned, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. I lunged for the door, throwing my body against it, holding it shut with all the strength I had left. "Lucas, let us in. You're so tired, so alone." The pressure against the door grew. I felt something push from the other side. Not fists, but a slow, pulsing force, like a heart beating against my spine. Sweat poured down my face, stinging my eyes. My fingers clawed at the wood, nails splintering. "Please, leave me alone," I sobbed. "You invited us. You fed us. You let us inside." I heard the voices all around me now, leaking from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The air thickened, vibrating with their hunger. The room darkened further, impossibly so. It felt as if light itself had been devoured, leaving only a black so dense it pushed into my lungs. Then I felt it, a soft breath against my neck. I spun around, but saw nothing. My pulse jackhammered, each beat a brutal electric shock. "We can make you whole, Lucas. We can finish what you started." Hands brushed my shoulders, my arms, my face. Invisible but heavy, as if the shadows themselves had grown fingers. I crashed to the floor, scrambling backward until I hit the bed. Shapes coalesced in the dark, silhouettes of figures, half-formed and twitching, faces I recognized. Eleanor, Marcus, Adeline, all shifting and merging, eyes opening and closing, mouths stretching too wide. "Join us. Be free of pain, free of loneliness, free of choice." I shook my head violently, pressing my palms against my ears. But the voices weren't in the room anymore. They were inside my skull, worming through every thought, every fragile fragment of me I had tried to protect. I felt that last ember inside me flicker. "Shh. It will be easier if you stop fighting." The shapes moved closer, arms extended, reaching, wrapping around my wrists and ankles. Their touch was ice and fire all at once, burning and freezing me to the marrow. I screamed, a raw, primal sound that clawed at the walls. I tried to crawl away, but they pinned me, pulling me down against the filthy carpet, my back arched, muscles locking. My mouth fell open in a silent, gaping cry as they poured into me. Memories flooded through me, no longer mine alone. Births and deaths, betrayals and worship, pain so ancient it tasted like earth and ash. I saw Adeline kneeling in the basin, essence pouring over her head like a baptism of tar. I saw Marcus break a man's jaw in a cage match, the audience roaring for blood. I saw Eleanor alone in a darkened room, her violin bow slicing the air, tears streaming down her cheeks. I felt all of them inside me, 1,000 lifetimes snarling and sobbing and singing, "Yes, yes, become, become." My vision buckled. Colors exploded behind my eyes, violent reds, impossible greens, ultraviolet fractures of thought that felt like razors slicing my consciousness into ribbons. Somewhere under all that screaming static, I felt that ember again. Tiny, weak, but alive. With a final, desperate surge, I wrenched my arms free and smashed my forehead against the floor. Pain exploded through my skull, sharp and white-hot, cutting through the fog. The shapes recoiled, the voices cracked and stuttered, shrieking in a unified, wounded cry. I rolled to my side, blood running down my face. My hand scrabbled for something, anything. My fingers closed around a splintered piece of wood from the broken dresser. I raised it like a dagger, pressing the sharp end against my chest. "Get out!" I roared, my voice a hurricane tearing through the black. The room convulsed. Shadows twisted into a cyclone, the air tearing at my skin, howling with rage and fear and desperation. I pushed harder, the wood biting into my flesh, my breath coming in savage, broken gasps. "No, you are us! You are ours!" I felt them tear at me, clawing to stay inside. But the ember, that impossible ember, flared once more, a blinding surge of pure defiance. I screamed again, the sound tearing my throat raw. And then, silence. The shadows evaporated, dissolving into the black corners of the room. The hands vanished. The pressure on my skull lifted, leaving an echoing emptiness that rang in my bones. I fell forward, the splinter clattering to the floor. My forehead hit the carpet. My body convulsed once, twice, then went limp. I lay there, trembling, blood pooling beneath me, breath shuddering out in ragged sobs. I didn't know if I had won. I didn't know if they were truly gone or just waiting, coiled deeper, ready to bloom again. All I knew was that, for one moment, I was alone. And for the first time in forever, I could finally hear my own heartbeat. When I woke, everything hurt. My skull felt like it had been split open and stitched back together with rusty wire. My chest ached with each shallow breath, every inhale scraping against my ribs like a blade. I lay there for what felt like hours, face pressed into the carpet, surrounded by the sharp, metallic smell of blood and the sour tang of sweat. The room was silent. No whispers, no phantom hands, no flickering shapes crawling across the ceiling, just the hum of a cheap motel refrigerator and the faint buzz of the neon sign outside leaking through the thin curtains. I forced my eyes open. The early morning light bled into the room, pale and almost apologetic. Dust drifted lazily through the beams like drifting ash. Slowly I rolled onto my back, staring up at the cracked ceiling tiles. My heart beat unevenly, each thud echoing like a distant drum. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt alone. It wasn't relief, not exactly. It was something heavier, something that settled into my bones like cold rain, a gnawing hollowness where the collective had been. I touched my chest, expecting to feel the splinter of wood still embedded there, but found only dried blood and tender, bruised skin. I dragged myself up to sit on the edge of the bed. My limbs moved like they belonged to someone else, each muscle shivering in protest. I looked around the room. The dresser was shattered, wood splinters scattered across the floor. The mirror hung crooked, cracked down the middle like a wounded eye. The carpet was stained with dark smears that I didn't want to examine too closely. I ran a trembling hand over my face. My stubble scraped against my palm, grounding me in a way I didn't expect. Then I saw my reflection in the broken mirror. I barely recognized the man staring back at me. His eyes were sunken, ringed with bruises. His lips were cracked and swollen, dried blood painting them like a grotesque smile. But there was something else, something that made my breath hitch, a tiny glimmer behind his gaze, something human. I stumbled to the sink and turned on the faucet. The water coughed and sputtered before finally gushing out in a rusty stream. I cupped my hands and drank greedily, ignoring the metallic taste, letting it spill down my chin and onto the floor. I splashed my face, rubbing at the dried blood and sweat, watching the water swirl red and brown down the drain. When I looked up again, the man in the mirror looked a little more like me. Still broken, still haunted, but me. I pressed my forehead against the glass, breathing slowly, trying to collect the fragments of myself that felt scattered across 1,000 lifetimes. Then, through the open window, I heard a sound that froze my veins, a low, distant humming. At first I thought it was the wind or a passing car, but as I listened, I realized it was too deliberate, too rhythmic. A melody. Faint, like someone humming to themselves in another room. Sweet, almost comforting, if not for the sharp edge beneath it, a predatory undertone that raised the tiny hairs on my neck. I turned, heart hammering in my chest. Out in the parking lot, under the weak morning light, stood a figure. Not Adeline this time. A young woman. Early 20s maybe. Long dark hair that tumbled over her shoulders like an oil spill. Her skin looked almost translucent in the gray dawn. She wore a simple white dress that billowed slightly in the breeze. She stood perfectly still, head tilted to one side as if she were listening to something only she could hear. Her lips moved in that silent humming, eyes locked onto my window. Our eyes met. A jolt of electric dread surged through me. I knew her. Jess. The newcomer, the one Adeline had spoken about, the one who would carry on the work. Her smile bloomed slowly, too wide, teeth too straight and too white. She lifted a hand in a slow, graceful wave. The humming grew louder, worming its way through the thin motel walls, sliding into my ears and settling at the base of my spine. Stumbled back from the window, crashing into the edge of the bed. My legs buckled, dumping me onto the floor. "Lucas!" The voice was everywhere and nowhere, wrapping around my ribs like barbed wire. We never left. We were only waiting. I clamped my hands over my ears, shaking my head violently. "No, no, no!" I chanted like a child hiding from monsters under the blanket. But Jess kept humming. Her silhouette blurred and flickered, as though she were vibrating at a frequency I couldn't comprehend. I crawled toward the bathroom, pulling myself across the carpet, nails tearing at the fibers. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it, as if that thin latch could hold back an entire sea of voices. I slumped against the bathtub, gasping, my chest heaving so hard I thought my ribs might splinter. The humming seeped through the walls, softer now, almost tender. "You are the fracture, Lucas. You are the doorway. You are the invitation." Tears spilled down my face, my forehead dropped against the cold porcelain of the tub. I realized then that it wasn't about escape. It never had been. I was marked, a carrier. A seed planted deep inside me, ready to bloom wherever I ran. Out in the room, I heard the door creak open. The humming stopped. Silence folded over everything, thick and heavy as grave dirt. I held my breath. Then, a single deliberate footstep. The bathroom door rattled. At first, it was just a gentle shiver, as if someone had lightly tapped it with their fingertips. But then the rattling grew, echoing through the cramped space, each vibration crawling up my spine like a centipede. I pressed my back harder against the tub, breath coming in short, ragged bursts. My fingers dug into the porcelain edge, knuckles bleached white. Outside, the footsteps moved deliberately, each one punctuated by an unnatural pause, as though whoever or whatever was out there was savoring each movement. "Lucas?" The voice was soft now, almost a coo. "Why are you hiding? You've already invited us in." I slammed my hands over my ears, but the voice pressed through anyway. seeping in like smoke under a door. A creak. I looked up just in time to see the doorknob turning, impossibly slow. My stomach flipped. My pulse hammered so loudly it filled my head with a roaring static. Then the latch clicked open. The door swung in, revealing Jess. She stood there in the doorway, framed by the sickly motel light, her hair cascading around her face like a dark waterfall. Her eyes gleamed, not with warmth or anger, but with an endless, patient hunger. Her lips curled into that too wide smile, and she took a step inside. Lucas. I scrambled backward into the corner, knees to my chest, arms wrapped tight around myself like a last pathetic shield. Jess tilted her head to one side, studying me the way a scientist might study a pinned insect. "You don't have to be afraid," she whispered, her voice syrupy and thick. "We're here to help you finish what you started." I shook my head violently, tears flying from my face. "No, please, leave me alone. I don't want this." Her smile softened, almost pitying. "But you do, Lucas. You always did. The moment you stepped into Morrow Creek, you asked to be remade, to be freed from that small, brittle version of yourself. We only gave you what you asked for." I pressed my forehead into my knees, shaking. I remembered Adeline's touch, the essence pouring down my throat, the countless voices that had burrowed into me. I remembered the ember, that last defiant spark, but now it felt distant, weak, barely a tremor against the tide rising inside me. Jess took another step, her bare feet whispering across the cracked tiles. "You were supposed to be the bridge," she murmured, "a conduit between us and the world above. But you ran, and now you've left a fracture." She knelt in front of me. Her fingers reached out, brushing against my cheek. Her skin was cold, slick with that floral metallic scent that filled my nightmares. I flinched, but her grip tightened, nails biting into my jawline. "It doesn't have to be like this," she said, voice dropping lower, almost tender. "You can accept it. Let go. Become whole." I wanted to fight, to shove her away, to scream, but my limbs felt distant, heavy as lead. My vision pulsed at the edges, each beat echoing with the whispers I thought I had escaped. "Lucas, Lucas, come home." Jess leaned in, her forehead resting against mine. Her breath was sweet and sour, an intoxicating decay. "Let me show you," she whispered. Then, a surge of images crashed through me. I saw fields of black flowers swaying under a blood-red moon, vast underground halls filled with glass vats, each one pulsing with shapes desperate to escape. I saw people kneeling in a circle, chanting as they poured the essence over each other, skin splitting open to reveal roots, tendrils glowing veins. I saw Adeline, her hands outstretched, her mouth open in silent exultation as Jess stepped forward, anointed with a thick, shimmering oil. I saw myself, floating in the basin, my eyes rolled back, my chest blooming open like a flower to reveal an endless abyss inside. I felt my mind fracture, splinter after splinter, each one carrying pieces of me away into the dark. I convulsed, back arching so violently I thought my spine might snap. A howl clawed its way up my throat, ripping free in a sound that was barely human. Jess pulled back, watching me with wide, rapturous eyes. "Yes," she breathed. "That's it. Open yourself. Let us in." The ember inside me flared weakly, like a dying star flickering in the void. "No," I croaked, my voice so small it felt foreign. "Please, no." Jess pressed her palm against my chest, directly over my heart. I felt something slip beneath my skin. A cold, writhing presence that coiled around my ribs, twisting tighter and tighter. "We've waited so long," she whispered. "Let us finish this." I felt the last threads of myself slipping. Sophie's laughter in the kitchen at sunrise. My mother's rough hands braiding my hair when I was a boy. The smell of wet concrete after summer rain. One by one they blinked out, each memory devoured by the black tide surging up inside me. Jess's smile widened, her eyes bright with ecstatic triumph. "Welcome home, Lucas. I gasped, my body shaking uncontrollably. My fingers scraped at the tile, leaving bloody smears. Then, a crack. Something deep inside me split. A soundless rupture that felt like a chasm opening in my soul. The ember, that impossible, defiant spark, flared one final time. A blinding, searing burst that tore through my veins like wildfire. I screamed, the sound splitting the room. My hands shot up, grabbing Jez by the shoulders. Her eyes widened in shock, her smile faltering. "No!" she shrieked. "Don't fight!" But I did. I shoved her back, the force sudden and primal. She crashed into the wall, her head slamming against the tile with a sickening crack. She slid to the floor, her body twitching, eyes wide and glassy. I collapsed beside the tub, my breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. For a moment, everything stopped. No whispers, no visions, just the hammering of my own heart, thundering in the quiet. I didn't know if I had won. I didn't know if the ember would last. But as I dragged myself to my feet, blood dripping from my hands, I realized I had chosen, and for now, that was enough. I didn't know how long I stood there. Blood dripped from my fingertips in slow, steady pulses, each drop echoing in the cramped motel bathroom like a ticking clock counting down to something inevitable. Jess's body lay crumpled against the wall, her head twisted at an unnatural angle. Her eyes, those bright, hungry eyes, stared into nothing. I wanted to look away, but my gaze locked onto her face, transfixed by the horror and finality of it. My breath sawed in and out of my chest, each inhale a knife. My throat felt raw, my lips chapped and stained dark. The air smelled like copper and old flowers, that same sweet, rotting perfume that had followed me since Morrow Creek. I pressed my palm against the sink to steady myself. The cracked porcelain bit into my skin, grounding me. "Lucas. Lucas." The whisper rose again, softer this time. Not the triumphant roar of the collective, but something else. Thin, needy, almost pleading. "You can't run. You can't carry it alone. You are the fracture. You are the door." I staggered out of the bathroom, my legs jelly beneath me. The room felt smaller than before, the walls breathing in and out, the ceiling sagging as if under some massive weight. My reflection in the broken mirror watched me with a fractured grin, pieces of my face floating in separate shards. I turned away, bile crawling up my throat. The motel door hung open now. Inside, the morning had broken into a bruised blue-gray, the sun still a rumor behind thick clouds. The parking lot was empty, no cars, no distant hum of life, just a heavy, pressing silence that felt like it might suffocate me. I shuffled forward, each step leaving a sticky print. My sneakers squelched with every movement. The cool air hit my face, sharp and almost painful. I sucked it in greedily, as if I hadn't breathed real air in years. A crow perched on the motel sign, cawed once, the sound slicing through the silence like a blade. Its head cocked to one side, watching me with that uncanny, too intelligent stare. I limped past it, down the cracked steps, out onto the asphalt. I looked around wildly, expecting to see figures emerging from the trees or shadows sliding along the edges of buildings. But there was nothing, only me and the echo. "Lucas, please, let us in. Let us finish." My hands flew to my ears again, pressing so hard my skull throbbed. "Shut up," I gasped. "Shut up, shut up, shut up." The whisper shivered, retreated, then surged forward again, clawing up my spine, wrapping around my ribs like a vice. "You can't hold us back forever. You are the threshold. We will bloom through you." I fell to my knees on the asphalt, palms smacking against the rough surface. My forehead touched the ground, my breath coming in ragged gulps. Memories churned through me, jagged and feverish. Adeline's cold fingers. The basin. The humming in the woods. Sophie's silhouette slipping out the door that morning in LA. The ember flickered deep inside me. The last fragment of me, the final remnant of Lucas Merrick. I curled my fingers into fists, nails biting into my palms until hot blood dripped between my knuckles. "I am not yours," I growled. each word torn from somewhere below language, somewhere primal and furious. "Then you are nothing." The whisper lashed across my mind like a whip, white-hot and blinding. I roared, the sound tearing from my chest like an animal breaking free of a trap. A sudden rush of wind slammed into me, almost knocking me backward. The crow took off from the sign, wings beating violently as it shrieked and vanished into the sky. I staggered upright, swaying on unsteady legs. The road stretched ahead of me, empty and endless. Each side was flanked by thick trees, their trunks dark and silent. In the distance, the highway sign glowed faintly, civilization, or at least the promise of it. I stumbled forward, each step feeling like it might be my last. I knew I wasn't free. Not really. The essence still pulsed inside me, a dark echo waiting, coiled like a serpent. But I had chosen, and that choice burned brighter than any whisper they could conjure. As I reached the edge of the lot, I turned back one last time. The motel stood silent, its sign flickering. Room 12's door gaped open, a black hole swallowing the morning light. For a second, I thought I saw Jess standing there again, but when I blinked, she was gone. I kept moving. The sun began to rise behind the clouds, turning them into a smear of molten gray and bruised purple. I imagined the ember inside me glowing with that same muted light, small but defiant, a lighthouse in a sea of ink. "We will wait. We will grow. We will finish." Their whisper floated along the breeze, soft as breath against my neck. "Try," I spat into the wind. My voice echoed back to me, small and broken, but it was mine. The trees thinned as I approached the road. I felt my lungs expand with each new lungful of air. Each heartbeat thudded through me like a war drum, reminding me that I was still here. I didn't know where I would go. I didn't know who I would become. But as my feet hit the road and I took that first painful step into the unknown, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't their vessel, not today. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to keep the ember alive a little longer. I don't know how far I walked before I realized I was crying. The tears came silently, slipping down my dirt-caked cheeks, dripping onto the cracked asphalt beneath my feet. I didn't wipe them away. Each one felt like a confession, a quiet proof that I was still capable of feeling something real. Every step hurt. My legs throbbed with exhaustion, my shoes soaked through with blood and sweat. The skin at the back of my heels had split open, leaving raw, stinging gashes. My fingers twitched at my sides, stained a deep, rusty red. The highway finally came into view, a lonely, snaking line cutting through the dense Oregon forest. I stood at its edge, staring down the empty stretch of road that shimmered in the early morning haze. I felt the wind push against me, cold and sharp, carrying the smell of pine and wet moss. It felt clean, untouched. For a moment, it was enough to steady my shaking breath. "Lucas, Lucas, Lucas," the whisper returned, fainter now. Less a scream, more a sigh echoing from a faraway cave. I pressed my palms against my temples, squeezing my skull until stars popped behind my eyes. "No," I hissed under my breath. "You don't get to have me, not now." The wind rose, tearing at my clothes, pulling at the edges of the whisper. I took a step forward onto the asphalt, then another. Each one felt like a small act of defiance, a tiny rebellion against the black tide still lapping at the edge of my mind. I thought of Adeline, standing in that cavernous room, her hands outstretched, her eyes shining with fanatic devotion. I thought of Jess, her too-wide smile, her cold fingers sinking into my skin. I thought of all the shapes in those vats, their eyes pressed to the glass, their whispers curling through my veins. I thought of the ember, that impossible flicker, the last proof of my humanity. As I walked, I began to mutter to myself. Names, memories, fragments of who I had been before Morrow Creek swallowed me. Sophie, the apartment on Rose Avenue, the smell of rain on hot pavement, my father's old watch, the way the ocean sounded at night. Each word felt like a thread stitching me back together, however messily. A battered pickup truck approached in the distance, its headlights cutting through the fog. I hesitated, part of me wanting to lurch forward, wave my arms, beg for help. Another part wanted to turn and disappear into the woods, to become something feral and unseen. The truck slowed as it neared. I caught my reflection in the windshield as it pulled up. A gaunt, ragged man, eyes wide and haunted, face smeared with blood and dirt. The driver's window rolled down. A middle-aged man with a gray beard leaned out, eyes narrowing as he scanned me. "Jesus Christ, you okay, son?" he asked, voice gravelly and cautious. I opened my mouth, but no words came out at first. My throat felt like it was packed with ash. "Please, I need to get away," I croaked, each syllable scraping like broken glass. The man studied me for a moment, eyes flicking to the forest behind me, then back to my face. Something in him softened. "Get in," he said, nodding toward the passenger seat. I stumbled around the front of the truck, pulling the door open with trembling hands. The warmth of the cab hit me like a punch, and I collapsed into the seat, my head lolling against the window. The man didn't ask more questions. He just pulled back onto the road, tires crunching over the gravel shoulder, before merging onto the empty highway. For a few miles, the only sounds were the rumble of the engine and the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers. I stared out the window, watching the trees blur into a gray-green smear. Then, faintly beneath the engine's hum, I heard it again. "Lucas, Lucas, we are not done." My body seized. My fingers curled into claws against my knees. A low, guttural groan slipped from my lips before I could stop it. The man glanced over, alarm flashing across his face. Hey, you need a hospital? You having a seizure or something?" I forced a shaky breath, squeezing my eyes shut. "Keep driving," I managed, voice strangled and raw. "Please, just keep going." He nodded, knuckles whitening around the steering wheel. The whisper receded again, pushed back into the depths of my skull, but it left a phantom ache behind, like the ghost of a migraine, a pulsing reminder that the collective was still lurking in the dark corners of my mind. I leaned my forehead against the cold glass, breathing in small, shallow gulps. The highway unrolled endlessly ahead, a ribbon of cracked asphalt vanishing into a low bank of mist. For the first time in what felt like lifetimes, I let my eyes close without immediately bracing for a vision or a whisper. I saw Sophie again, her face soft and distant, a memory floating somewhere just out of reach. I saw my mother, her hands rough but gentle, tucking me into bed after a thunderstorm. I saw the ember, flickering, small but still burning. I pressed my fingers to my chest, feeling my heartbeat, fast and uneven but undeniably alive. I didn't know if I could ever truly outrun them. I didn't know if one day I would wake up and find Adeline standing over me, or hear Jess's humming in the walls of some new room. But in that moment, barreling down a nameless Oregon highway in a stranger's truck, I felt a fragile hope. A brutal, stubborn kind of hope, sharp-edged and dangerous, like holding a shard of glass in your palm and choosing not to let go. I opened my eyes. The sun finally broke through the clouds, spilling pale gold across the road. And for that single, impossible moment, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, I was more than the fracture, more than the vessel, more than the echo. I was Lucas Merrick, and I was still here. Thank you for making it all the way to the end of this journey with me. I know this story wasn't easy. It was dark, twisted, and at times, maybe too close to the places we try to keep hidden inside ourselves. But that's exactly what makes these stories powerful. They force us to confront the shadows that linger just beyond the edges of our comfort. Lucas's story isn't just about horror. It's about identity, survival, and the terrifying question of what we're willing to sacrifice to escape our pain. Maybe you saw a piece of yourself in him, that small, flickering ember you refuse to let die, no matter how heavy the darkness presses down. I hope this tale reminded you that even in our most fractured moments, there's still something inside us worth fighting for, no matter how small, no matter how fragile. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing, leaving a comment, or sharing it with someone who loves diving into the deep, unsettling corners of the human mind. Your support means the world, and it helps keep these stories alive. Thank you for listening. Thank you for daring to follow Lucas into the dark and back again. Until next time, sleep with one eye open and keep that ember burning. Good night.